Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on consulting agreements this morning. My name is Angela Knierim. I'm a salary partner in our Munich's life sciences team, and I advise on all aspects of medical devices and medicinal products, cosmetics, and biocides around the whole product cycle, with a focus on advertising law and compliance questions such as consulting agreements. Thank you for joining us. And I would say let's start. We start with a quick look at the agenda. We are talking about consulting agreements and start with the question what consulting agreements actually are. And then we'll have a look at the 4 basic principles of cooperation with healthcare professionals, short HCPs, and also have a brief look at cost for travel, accommodation, and meals. What are consulting agreements and which regulations apply? Consulting agreements obviously refer to consultancy services provided by healthcare professionals to the industry. That could cover meetings, for example, the participation in advisory board meetings, the draft of essays or documentation, for example, in observational studies referring to real-world data which are of particular interest for the industry. And with regard to this point, I would like to draw attention to the fact that there is a regulation which is sometimes overseen in the professional code for physicians. When a physician participates in research activities that refer to the integrity of a person or to individual data, there is a specific rule that the physician might have to consult with the ethics committee, which is regulated in section 15 of the Model Professional Code for Physicians. So keep that in mind whenever research is subject of a consulting agreement, that this regulation might apply. And also it's important to differentiate from actual clinical trials because specific regulations might apply in this case. And the service must be related to an indication of the company's products. So it cannot be independent from the field of activity of the company. And a quick indication. I didn't say in the beginning, if you have any questions, we have a chat area where you can raise any questions. If I don't manage to answer all of them within this webinar, I will come back to you later. So please feel free to ask any questions you have. Possible consultants can be clinicians or other employees, the medical facilities themselves. I will talk about that later, and also physicians in private practice. And everything we talk about in this webinar generally also applies to other types of corporations with healthcare professionals, for example, speaker contracts. So in particular, the basic principles apply for all types of cooperation with healthcare professionals. What are the legal restrictions? There are no legal restrictions specifically for consulting agreements, but it is very important to differentiate consulting agreements from unilateral benefits to healthcare professionals. The difference is that when it comes to a consulting agreement, the healthcare professional provides the service in exchange for remuneration, whereas the unilateral benefit is when the industry grants a benefit without receiving a consideration in return. Why is this differentiation important? we have a general prohibition of unilateral benefits in the course of product-related advertising, which is regulated in the German Therapeutic Products Advertising Act, the HBG. There are specific regulated exceptions, but generally unilateral benefits are prohibited. And also, we have a criminal prohibition of bribery in the healthcare sector, as well as of corruption in office, which apply to physicians, for example, in university hospitals. There are also respective regulations in the professional codes of conduct for physicians. They are different in every state of Germany, but you can always refer to the model professional code of conduct for physicians, the Musterberufsordnung, which reflects actually the regulations by law also in the professional code. And then we also have several codes of conduct from the different associations. For example, the FSA Code of Conduct for Medicinal Products and the BFAMED Medical Devices Code for Medical Devices. And there's also service law for public servants, which applies to physicians employed in university clinics, which also has implications for drafting contracts. I will come back to that later. Here's a quick overview of the rules for practice. The 4 basic principles I have already referred to when we had a look at the agenda. These 4 principles, the principle of separation, transparency, equivalence, and documentation, they are not regulated in statutory law, but they are derived from the legal requirements, and they have been developed in practice. And these 4 basic principles have also found expression in the codes of conduct of the different associations. For example, in section 3 of the BFAMED Medical Devices Code. And these 4 principles, they form kind of the common sense of what is accepted as socially adequate and therefore permissible when it comes to cooperations with healthcare professionals. So we will have a look at that. Yes, as I said, there are different codes of conduct. The most well-known are the FSA codes and the BFAMED and MedTech codes, but there are other ones, for example, the AKG code for medicinal products. But this is a collection of the most well-known codes of conduct. They have partly regulations that are stricter than the requirements by law. So generally speaking, it's recommendable to observe the rules of these code of conducts, even if a company is not a member, because these code of conducts, they are only binding for members. They are not legally binding. They are only binding for members of these associations. But in practice, it's always recommendable to observe these rules, as I said, because they are mostly even stricter than the legal requirements. So it's kind of a safe haven and a good orientation and practice of what is generally acceptable in cooperation with healthcare professionals. The 4 basic principles, we start with the principle of separation. In a nutshell, the principle of separation means that payments to healthcare professionals must not be dependent on sales transactions or any decisions on procurement, prescription, or therapy by the physician. And this is because it is impermissible to grant benefits with the aim to influence the procurement decisions or the medical prescriptions or therapy decisions of a physician. So the payments must be separated from the therapy decision of the doctor. The background is that doctors should focus on the on their patients and the best therapeutic decision for their patient, and they should not have anything else in mind other than the best therapeutic decision for their patient. So this is the background of this principle. Do's and don'ts. To avoid any false impression from the outset, it's generally recommendable to conclude the contract with the medical facility, the hospital, and not with individual clinicians or other employees. This obviously only is possible if the physician is employed. So if it's a physician who is self-employed, obviously that does not apply, but if possible, it's recommendable to conclude the contract with the institution. In the contract and also in practice, payments should not be linked to procurement decisions, and also the industry, the company should not grant any benefits that serve private purposes or grant any benefits to third persons who do not provide for the services on the basis of the contract, for example, relatives or spouses. The principle of transparency means that the actual fact of cooperation and also the content and the extent of cooperation should be made transparent. In the first place, any agreement and any cooperation should be based on a contract in writing. And upon request, this contract should be submitted to the competent medical association. And this is actually explicitly regulated in the Model Professional Code for Physicians. So this should be kept in mind that upon request, physicians are obliged to submit any cooperation agreements to their competent medical association. Another very, very important factor is that employed physicians require an employer's permit. It's the so-called Dienstherrengenehmigung. And this employer's permit should be obtained at the time of signing of the contract. In practice, we generally attach it to the contract. So the employer also signs the contract and confirms he agrees with the content of the contract and has taken note of it. In the case of physicians that are employed in public institutions, for example, university, hospitals, in addition to the employer's permit, there is a secondary employment permit required. So you need, in this case, you need two permits. First, the employer's permit, and second, the secondary employment permit, which is the so-called Nebentätigkeitsgenehmigung. And this requirement is regulated in the state law for university hospitals and for public servants. And in practice, most of the universities already have a form for that. So it's the easiest way just to ask the physician whether his or her university hospital provides for a specific form, and this form could also be integrated in the contract, or, which is also sufficient, the contract could provide for an obligation to obtain this secondary employment permit. Do's and don'ts with regard to the principle of transparency. As I said, it's recommendable to attach the employer's permit of employed physicians to the contract and to let the employer sign this employer's permit. And with regard to university hospitals, it's best to use their official form if they provide for such form and to also attach it to the contract. It's also recommendable to integrate a clause in the contract that it only becomes effective subject to the respective approval. And the contract should not be, it should be concluded in advance. So services or remunerations should not be made before the contract is effective. I see that we have a first question. The question refers to physicians from other EU member states. So this webinar is focused on primarily German law and also EU law when it comes to the EU codes of conduct. So if there is another EU member involved, I would advise to first have a look at the if it's about medical devices, the MedTech code, and see if there are any specific regulations for such cases. And other than that, to be sure, this question would have to be checked with a colleague from the respective state. But as a pragmatic approach, I would advise to have a look at the associations codes and then double check with a colleague from the respective member state or other extraterritorial state. The principle of equivalence, this refers to the rule that consulting service and remuneration must be in reasonable proportion to each other, which is also called fair market value. There is no explicit regulation what proportionate is or what a fair market value is. This always depends on a case-by-case assessment. The background of this rule is that it should be ensured that payments made by the industry for services provided by physicians are solely remuneration for the fulfillment of the contract and not intended to buy procurement, prescription, or treatment decisions or any associated goodwill. For German physicians, the fee structure for physicians, the GOE, can be used as a reference point, but it does not reflect any possible form of cooperation. So this is rather an orientation in practice, but does not actually regulate the amount of fees that would be proportionate. As I said, it's always a case-by-case decision, and in practice, the criteria to determine what a fair market value is are the time which is required for the respective service, the degree of difficulty, is it an easy task or a complicated scientific question, the value for the company, is it an important step in product development, or how important is the service for the company and how valuable, the documentation effort for the physician, and also the expertise of the individual physician. Is it a well-known and a highly qualified physician, an expert in this field? This would justify a higher remuneration than someone who is does not have a particular expertise in this field. And also what is important is the standards of the market, the value of this service generally on the market. As a rule of thumb, when you take into account the German fee structure for physicians, the GOE, it can be said that fees around 120 euros per hour might generally be considered reasonable according to the case law of the FSA Code of Conduct and the FSA arbitration practice. This is a rough rule of thumb, as I said, it always depends on a case-by-case decision, but around 120 euro per hour should be defendable. Here are some examples from the case law of the FSA Arbitration Board. The FSA is an association for medicinal products, but it's often used in practice as an orientation point. And I've just listed a few examples here, what they found to be permissible or impermissible. For example, they found that a remuneration of 200 euros for a total 2.5 hours work time, they found is appropriate. And they also said a remuneration of 456 euros per patient as part of an observational study for more than 24 months and including several visits is also considered appropriate. What they found is impermissible is a remuneration of 1,000 euros for generic field studies with a maximum work time of 1 hour. This is a pretty obvious case, I think. But what they also found is that a remuneration of 150 euro, which is not that much for a case report, is inappropriate if the preparation time is only 30 minutes. So these are some examples how the arbitration board has decided. However, as I mentioned earlier, the FSA Code of Conducts, they only apply and they are only binding for members of the FSA. However, I think it's a good orientation in practice also for non-members. The principle of documentation basically means that everything should be done in writing. The contract itself, and the contract should also include the reasons for the industry's interest in cooperating with the physician. So this should be explained in the contract why the company wants to work with this physician and also why the company chooses this individual physician. For example, because of the expertise, the status as a renowned expert, publications in the respective field, and this should actually be explained. I often see in draft contracts that maybe it's because the parties feel it's too obvious that this part is actually missing. It should be explained in the contract. And also what I often see in practice is that the services are not described in detail. So I often see that the services are described as, for example, consulting on product development in the field of diabetes, let's say. And this is not sufficient. It should be explicitly listed and explicitly explained what the physician what kind of services the physician owes. For example, concrete draft of an essay on XYZ. And it should also be included in the contract the estimated time for such service. So it could be regulated that the parties expect that this service will take about 1 hour, and so on. This should be explicitly regulated. And of course, all remunerations and payments. And also the final work product should be documented, and this should be regulated as an obligation in the contract. Yeah, some of the do's and don'ts I already mentioned. As I said, which is very important to include a detailed description of all services and also include an obligation for the physician to document what work he or she has done, and also archive the contract and the documented work results. And which would be a clear don't is a only generic description of services. This would not be sufficient with regard to the principle of documentation. Now we'll have a quick look at the cost for travel, accommodation, and meals. Generally speaking, as I said, sometimes the codes of conduct from the different associations have slightly stricter rules. So if your company is a member of an association, always double check with the respective code of conduct. But generally speaking, economy class flight tickets for flights within the European Union are fine, and for intercontinental flights, also business class tickets. Accommodation, hotel stays should only be paid for if this is necessary, and only as long as it is necessary. This also needs to be justified. And of course, hotels should not be any luxury hotels or holiday hotels, but standard business hotels. Hotel breakfast is fine if the overnight stay is justified, and other than that, the general rules for catering and hospitality apply. For example, the rules for work lunches. So there is no specific rule for consulting agreements with regard to catering, but the general rules apply. And with that, we are good in time. We come to the end of this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And also, please do reach out if you have any questions afterwards. These are my contact details. And yeah, thank you for joining this webinar, and have a nice and sunny day. I just have a quick look at the questions. We have a question. I will pick this one up. The question is if there are any differences regarding physicians or HCPs who are founders of a company. The question is no. If I cooperate with a practicing physician, this would not make a difference. All right, I think we don't have any other questions at this point, so thanks everyone for joining, and have a nice day. Bye.